Mark thought his biggest problem was neighbors using his pool without asking, but one day he caught something far more unsettling on camera. What he discovered turned his peaceful oasis into a place of suspicion and unease. Stay tuned as this story takes a shocking turn you won't see coming. But first, if you're enjoying our stories and want to support the channel, hitting that like button really helps us out and means a lot. You'd be doing us a huge favor. Mark Sanders had always cherished his independence. After years of grinding away at a job he didn't particularly love and a marriage that eventually fizzled out, he had finally managed to carve out a life of solitude in his modest suburban home. His house was his fortress, a place where he could escape the pressures of life. The backyard pool, in particular, had become his sanctuary. It was his personal retreat where he could float under the summer sun, hear nothing but the hum of nature around him, and let the stress melt away. He had built his privacy into the very core of his lifestyle, but as with all good things, his peace would soon come to an unexpected and troubling end. It started out innocently enough. The new neighbors, the Mitchells, were friendly. Though Mark had been polite but distant, he wasn't one for getting too close to people, preferring his space and keeping interactions to a minimum. Mrs. Mitchell, a single mother with 2 kids, seemed nice, albeit frazzled, always balancing groceries and soccer gear in her arms as she hurried in and out of the house. Her 2 children, Olivia, a bubbly 7-year-old, and her younger brother Max, were always running around the neighborhood, playing on their bikes and laughing with the other kids. At first, it seemed like a perfect situation. They kept to themselves, and he kept to himself. Then came the day he found Olivia in his pool. It was a blazing hot afternoon, and Mark had just returned from work, his shirt sticking to his back from the humidity. He stepped into his house and dropped his briefcase by the door, looking forward to a quiet evening by the water. He'd even picked up a cold 6-pack on his way home to really indulge in some much-needed relaxation. As he headed toward the backyard, something caught his eye. His wooden gate, which he always made sure was locked, was swinging open. His heart skipped a beat. Was it the wind? A raccoon? His mind raced through the possibilities. He was already tense when he stepped onto the patio, but nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. There, in the middle of his pool, was little Olivia, her blonde hair dripping wet as she bobbed up and down in an inflatable donut. She was giggling to herself, splashing her arms around in the water as if it were her personal swimming hole. It wasn't the sight of a little girl enjoying the water that irritated Mark. It was the fact that she had snuck into his private space without asking, without permission, without even a knock on the door. "Hey!" Mark called out, his voice sharp. Olivia froze, her wide blue eyes turned toward him, filled with shock and a bit of guilt. She immediately paddled her way to the side of the pool and pulled herself out, water dripping off her small frame as she stood there, her hands nervously wringing together. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her face red with embarrassment. Mark sighed, trying to calm his rising frustration. She was just a kid, after all. Still, the principle of the matter gnawed at him. "You can't just come into someone's yard without asking," he said, his tone firm but not angry. "This is my pool. You need permission, okay?" Olivia nodded, her lip quivering slightly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. It's so hot, and I wanted to swim." Mark softened. He remembered what it was like to be a kid, desperate for something fun to do during the long summer days. "All right," he said. "But next time, just ask. I don't mind if you want to swim, but you've got to ask first." Olivia nodded quickly and darted toward the gate, slipping through it and disappearing into her own yard. Mark watched her go, shaking his head. Kids. They were always getting into things. He figured that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next few days passed without incident. Mark swam in his pool, enjoyed his beers, and relished the quiet he'd fought so hard to maintain. But by the end of the week, the peaceful pattern was broken once again. It was early Saturday morning, and Mark had stepped outside to grab the newspaper when he noticed something strange. The pool cover, something he always carefully replaced after every swim, was slightly askew. He frowned, walking over to inspect it more closely. The damp footprints of small, bare feet on the patio told him everything he needed to know. "She's been here again," Mark muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. Later that afternoon, as if on cue, Olivia reappeared. This time he caught her red-handed, slipping through the gate with her towel under one arm and her inflatable donut under the other. "Olivia!" Mark called out, startling her. She jumped, spinning around with wide eyes. I just… She stammered. Mark walked over, his frustration barely contained. "What did I tell you last time?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "You have to ask. This is my pool." "I know," Olivia said, looking down at her feet, "but my mom was busy and I didn't think you'd mind." "It's not about whether I mind or not," Mark said, his voice growing more stern. "It's about respect. You can't just sneak into someone's yard. What if something happened to you? Your mom would never forgive me." Olivia looked like she might cry. Mark felt his anger slipping away, replaced by a familiar twinge of guilt. But before he could say anything else, Olivia turned and ran back home, leaving Mark standing there, feeling like the bad guy. He hoped that would be the last of it, but as the days wore on, Olivia kept returning. Sometimes he'd find her sitting on the edge of the pool, dangling her feet in the water. Other times, she'd be fully submerged, her little donut float keeping her buoyant as she drifted lazily in the sun. Each time, Mark would remind her that she needed to ask permission. Each time, she would apologize and promise not to do it again. But she always did. Frustration turned into annoyance. Annoyance turned into resentment. Mark found himself growing angrier with each passing day. His pool, the one thing that brought him peace, was now the center of a problem he couldn't seem to solve. He didn't want to yell at Olivia, she was just a kid, but something had to be done. One night, after yet another visit from Olivia, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring out at the moonlit pool. The solution came to him in a flash. He'd had enough. He wasn't going to confront her again. No more polite talks, no more warnings. He was going to take action. Drastic action. The next morning, Mark drove into town, stopping at a local hardware store. He wandered the aisles, his mind racing with possibilities. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a motion-activated sprinkler system. The idea was simple. If Olivia or anyone else came into his yard uninvited, they'd be met with a sudden blast of cold water. It wasn't harmful, but it would certainly make her think twice about sneaking in again. Mark spent the afternoon setting up the system, carefully positioning the sprinklers around the pool. He felt a small sense of satisfaction as he tested them, watching as jets of water shot out in all directions. This would solve the problem once and for all. For the next few days, things were quiet. Mark watched from his kitchen window, waiting for the inevitable moment when Olivia would try to sneak in again. But she didn't. The pool remained undisturbed, the water calm and inviting. Mark allowed himself to relax, confident that his plan had worked. But then, one afternoon, it happened. Olivia, carrying her inflatable donut, slipped through the gate once more, her small feet padding across the patio as she made her way toward the pool. Mark watched with bated breath as she approached the water, unaware of what was about to happen. Just as she reached the edge, the sprinklers activated with a hiss, sending jets of water spraying in all directions. Olivia shrieked in surprise, dropping her donut and stumbling backward as the cold water drenched her. Mark couldn't help but chuckle to himself. He felt a little bad for scaring her, but maybe this was the wake-up call she needed. Maybe now she would understand that his pool wasn't a free-for-all. But as he watched Olivia stand there, soaking wet and shivering, something changed. She didn't run away like he expected her to. Instead, she stood still, her eyes wide with shock. Then, slowly, she turned and looked up at Mark's window, her expression not one of anger or fear but of hurt. Mark's laughter died in his throat. Suddenly, he didn't feel so good about his little prank. Later that evening, there was a knock on Mark's door. He opened it to find Mrs. Mitchell standing there, Olivia hiding behind her. "Can we talk?" Mrs. Mitchell asked, her voice tense but calm. Mark nodded and stepped aside, letting her in. They sat at the kitchen table, an awkward silence hanging between them. Olivia sat next to her mother, her eyes downcast, still clutching her towel. "I'm really sorry about Olivia sneaking into your yard," Mrs. Mitchell began. "I didn't realize it had gotten so out of hand. She just, she loves swimming, and we don't have a pool and it's been so hot lately." Mark nodded, understanding. "I get it, but she can just keep sneaking in. I've told her over and over again." Mrs. Mitchell sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I know, and I'm sorry, but Olivia's been having a hard time lately. With everything going on at home, it's just been tough. The pool, it's kind of her escape. Mark frowned. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Mitchell hesitated for a moment before speaking. "My husband, Olivia's father, he left us a few months ago. It's been really hard on her. Swimming is the one thing that seems to make her happy. I didn't realize she was sneaking into your yard, and I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Mark's heart sank. He hadn't known. He had been so caught up in his own frustration that he hadn't stopped to consider what might be going on in Olivia's life. He looked over at the little girl, who was still sitting quietly, her head down. "It's okay," Mark said softly. "I didn't know." He took a deep breath, feeling a pang of guilt. Maybe he had overreacted. Maybe he had been too focused on his own need for privacy and not enough on what Olivia was going through. "You know," he said after a long pause, "I don't mind if Olivia wants to swim. She just has to ask. As long as I'm home, she can come over any time." Olivia looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" "Really," Mark said with a smile. "But no more sneaking in, okay? We'll make it a deal." Olivia grinned, her eyes lighting up for the first time since she had arrived. "I promise," she said. From that day on, Olivia never snuck into Mark's yard again. Instead, she would come over in the afternoons, knocking on the door and asking if she could swim. Mark always said yes, and sometimes he even joined her for a swim. They would race across the pool, play games, and laugh together, and over time, the pool became a place of joy and connection, rather than frustration and conflict. Mark had learned an important lesson. Sometimes it wasn't about setting up walls and boundaries to keep people out. Sometimes it was about letting the right people in.